Payback times.
The fish tank needed cleaning. That was the first thing I noticed when I sat down in Dr. Patel's waiting room. The algae creeping up the back glass in green furrows, the 2 remaining goldfish navigating it with the patient resignation of creatures who had long since stopped expecting better. Someone had taped a hand-lettered sign to the tank that read, "Nemo and Dory" in purple marker. Nemo was orange. Dory was also orange. Nobody had told them. I settled my purse on my lap and looked around. Beige walls, the particular shade of institutional beige that said we tried to be calming and gave up. A rack of pamphlets near the door, cholesterol management, flu shots, a sun-faded brochure about colon screenings that had probably been there since the Obama administration. The chairs were the stackable kind with padded seats in a dusty blue, and the man across from me was reading something on his phone with the concentration of someone pretending he wasn't in a waiting room. A child. Near the window had given up all pretense and was simply lying on the carpet, staring at the ceiling tiles. I understood the impulse. It had been 2 years since I'd sat in a waiting room as a patient. The last time I'd been with Bernard, his oncology follow-up in January, 14 months before he died. I'd sat beside him and held his hand and done the thing I'd trained myself to do in 30 years of hospital work. I'd read the room, checked the signage, noted the privacy screens at the check-in desk, or the absence of them. Old habit. The compliance officer's curse. You can never just be somewhere. You're always also observing. Bernard used to tease me about it. "Miriam, we're at a restaurant. You don't need to assess the kitchen's sanitation protocols." I missed that. The particular texture, but I was here today for myself, which still felt faintly foreign. 18 months since Bernard passed, and my children had taken turns herding me toward normalcy. My daughter Adaze calling from Atlanta every Sunday. My son Kwame stopping by with groceries and opinions. When Kwame had suggested last month that I consolidate my care with a physician in his network, someone he could coordinate with, he said, the way he said most things, with a quiet confidence that had served him well since medical school, I had smiled and changed the subject. I had not chosen a doctor in his network. Dr. Patel's practice was on the east side of the city, a 40-minute drive from my house, a world away from the corridors where Kwame practiced. I'd found her through my insurance portal, board-certified, good reviews, a focus on women's health and midlife. No connection to Kwame's multi-specialty group. No shared electronic health record system, as far as I could determine from the practice's website. I'd done my research the way I'd always done research, methodically and with a specific outcome in mind. My outcome was simple. I wanted a doctor who would talk to me, not to my son. The receptionist, a young woman with box braids and a name tag that read Courtney, had handed me a new patient packet when I checked in. 12 pages, which was about average. I took the clipboard to my chair and worked through it with the pen I'd brought from home, because the waiting room pens always ran out of ink at the worst moment. Name, date of birth, insurance information, emergency contact. I listed Adaze for the emergency contact. She was calmer in a crisis. And also she was in Atlanta, which meant she could not sweep in and start managing things. Then I turned to page 7. The HIPAA authorization form was tucked between the medication history section and the consent for treatment. Standard placement. Where most people's eyes were beginning to glaze over, it was a reasonable form, clearly drafted by someone who knew the regulations. It explained in plain language that the practice would use and disclose protected health information only as permitted by the HIPAA privacy rule and applicable state law. It offered a list of individuals the patient could authorize to receive their health information: spouse, adult child, other family member, caregiver, other. I read every line. I read the fine print at the bottom, which described how authorization could be revoked and what the process entailed. I read the section explaining that authorization was voluntary, that refusing to authorize disclosure would not affect the patient's ability to receive treatment. I read it the way a jeweler reads a stone she's been handed, not with alarm, not with suspicion, simply with the attention that comes from knowing exactly what you're looking at and what it costs to get it wrong. I left the authorization section blank. No names, no family members. I initialed the box indicating I was declining to authorize third-party disclosure at this time, and I moved on. I signed the last page with the deliberateness that 22 years in hospital compliance will put into a signature. The particular quality of ink on paper, that means I know what I agreed to and I know what I didn't. The appointment itself was unremarkable in the best possible way. Dr. Patel was a small, precise woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a manner that suggested she had chosen medicine specifically because she found people interesting. She asked about Bernard without making it into a production, just noted his passing in my history, asked how I was sleeping, moved on. She was thorough without being performative about it. She ordered the standard panel for a woman my age. Lipid profile, thyroid, blood glucose, complete blood count, vitamin D. "Your blood pressure looks excellent," she said, and I told her I walked every morning, which was true. What I didn't say was that the walking had started as grief management and had become something else. A way of being alone with my thoughts that didn't feel like drowning. She seemed like someone I could work with. I scheduled a follow-up for the results and drove home through the October afternoon, the trees along the parkway doing their annual reluctant concession to change. 3 days later, my neighbor Paulette appeared at my door with a Tupperware container of jollof rice, and news she was clearly delighted to deliver. "I saw your Kwame at the Riverside Hospital Gala Friday night," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Paulette had been my neighbor for 19 years. She had opinions about everything and was usually right, which I found both useful and exhausting. "He was there with that nice young woman. The cardiologist?" "Dr. Abina Mensah-Cole," I said. "They've been seeing each other about 8 months." "She's lovely." Paulette accepted the tea I'd poured without being asked. "He mentioned you'd just started with a new doctor over on the east side. Said he was glad you'd finally made the appointment." She paused, the cup halfway to her lips. "Isn't that sweet, that he keeps up with you like that?" I was standing at the counter with my back to her, and whatever crossed my face in that moment, she didn't see it. I said. I had not told Kwame which practice I'd chosen. I had not told him I had an appointment scheduled. I had mentioned weeks ago that I was thinking about finding a new primary care physician, once, in passing, because he'd been pressing me about it. But the name of the practice, the east side, the appointment, none of that had come from me. "Sweet," I agreed, and turned around with my tea and my most neutral expression. After Paulette left, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. How does he know which practice? It was a question I filed carefully, the way you file something you aren't ready to look at yet. He called 4 days after my appointment on a Tuesday evening when I was sorting through Bernard's old books, deciding which ones to donate. This was a project I'd been deciding about for 6 months. Mostly, what I did was take them off the shelf, hold them, and put them back. The call started the way his calls always started, warm, efficient, the voice of a man who had learned to project calm because his patients needed it. He asked about my sleep, my appetite. He mentioned he'd run into Paulette's husband at the dry cleaner and that Mr. Asante had said I looked well. We talked about a Daisy's kids for a few minutes, my granddaughter's soccer tournament, my grandson's latest obsession with some card game I couldn't keep straight. And then, with the casual ease of someone mentioning the weather, "Mom, Dr. Patel mentioned your cholesterol numbers came back a little elevated. The LDL, specifically. You really should let me manage your care. It's so much easier if everything is centralized. I can coordinate with her directly, make sure we're not duplicating tests." The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. I know exactly how long because I counted. 22 years of sitting in conference rooms while physicians said things they should not have said had given me the ability to count to 2 in my head while my face did absolutely nothing. I said. "I'll think about it. I'm not trying to overstep," he said, which is what people say when they have already overstepped. "I just want to make sure you're taken care of." "I know you do," I said. "Let me think about it. Give Abina my love." We said our goodbyes. I put the phone down on Bernard's copy of The Souls of Black Folk and stood there in the quiet of the room. He said cholesterol numbers, LDL specifically. Not, "I heard you saw a doctor." Not, "Paulette mentioned you had an appointment." Numbers. A specific lipid panel result, the kind of information that lives in a medical record, not in gossip, not in a casual conversation, not in anything a son could hear through the ordinary channels of family communication, he said Dr. Patel mentioned. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, Bernard's desk, which I'd claimed in the months after he died, and I opened the bottom drawer. I keep legal pads in there, the yellow ones with the narrow rule, because I've never trusted the wide rule for serious work. I took out a fresh one and found a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote the date. I wrote the time, 7:42 p.m. I wrote my name. Then I began to write. October 14th. Received telephone call from Dr. Miriam Osei-Bonsu, son. During call, subject referenced cholesterol numbers being a little elevated and specifically mentioned LDL. Subject attributed this information to Dr. Patel. Patient self did not authorize disclosure of lab results or any protected health information to any third party, including family members, at time of intake. No HIPAA authorization form listing K. Osei-Bonsu as authorized recipient was signed. Results received approximately 24 hours prior to this call. I underlined no authorization twice, old habit. Then I sat back and thought carefully through what I actually knew about what had just happened. The HIPAA privacy rule is not ambiguous on this point. A covered entity, which a physician's practice most certainly is, cannot use or disclose a patient's protected health information without either a written authorization from the patient or a specific regulatory exception. The exceptions are defined. They include treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, the so-called TPO exceptions, and a handful of others involving public health, law enforcement, and imminent safety threats. A physician calling a patient's adult son to discuss her LDL numbers is not treatment. It is not payment. It is not healthcare operations. And it is categorically, unambiguously not permitted by the fact that the adult son is also a physician. This is the thing that most people, and in my experience, many healthcare workers, get wrong. They believe that medicine is a kind of brotherhood, that white coats confer access, that being family and being a doctor combines into some special category of allowed. I spent 2 decades disabusing people of this notion. I sat across from brilliant, well-meaning physicians, people who had dedicated their lives to healing, and explained to them, sometimes for the 3rd or 4th time, that their credentials did not entitle them to their wife's mammogram results, their father's cardiology notes, their college roommate's psychiatric records. The rule is not patients should generally have privacy unless a family member is a doctor. The rule is patients control their own health information, full stop. What Kwame had done, or what Dr. Patel had done, or what some combination of them had done, was disclose my protected health information without my authorization. Whether it was a casual conversation between colleagues, a records query through some shared system I wasn't aware of, or something else entirely, the mechanism didn't change the underlying fact. My information had gone somewhere I had not sent it. I wrote for another 20 minutes, documenting everything I remembered about the phone call in the precise, affectless language of incident reporting. What was said, in what order, what the reasonable interpretation of each statement was, what information had been disclosed that could only have come from a medical record. I documented Paulette's visit. I noted the unresolved question of how Kwame had known which practice I'd chosen before I told him. When I finished, I dated the bottom of the page, signed it, and set the pen down. The house was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog and farther away the particular hush of a suburban street on a Tuesday night, the sound of ordinary life proceeding on its ordinary terms. I went to the hall closet on the second floor, the one I'd been meaning to reorganize since last winter, and I found what I was looking for on the third shelf. 2 binders, burgundy, the spines labeled in my own handwriting, HIPAA privacy rule, training materials, updated 2019. There was a third one behind them, thinner, labeled enforcement and breach notification. I carried all 3 downstairs. I wasn't rusty, not exactly. The architecture of the regulation lives in a particular part of my mind that doesn't decay the way other things do. The way names and dates and where I put my reading glasses seem to erode at the edges. But I wanted the specifics under my hands. I wanted to be precise. I sat at Bernard's desk and opened the first binder. Protected health information, any individually identifiable health information held or transmitted by a covered entity. Covered entity, a health plan, a healthcare clearinghouse or a healthcare provider who transmits health information electronically. Authorization, a detailed document that gives covered entities permission to use protected health information for purposes outside of treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. I read the minimum necessary standard. I reread the provisions governing personal representatives, the rule that says family members are not automatically personal representatives unless they hold legal authority, such as a healthcare power of attorney. A medical degree is not a healthcare power of attorney. Being someone's son is not a healthcare power of attorney. I found the section I'd cited in probably 200 training sessions over the years, the one I used to put on the slide with the big red header that made residents shift in their seats, a covered entity may not disclose protected health information to a patient's family member, friend, or other person identified by the patient unless the patient has agreed to or requested the disclosure. Has agreed to or requested. I had done neither. I closed the binder at 9:15 p.m., stood up, stretched my back, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. While the water heated, I stood at the window looking out at the dark backyard, at the oak tree Bernard had planted 20 years ago, now taller than the house. I thought about my son, his intentions, which were probably good, and his assumptions, which were not his to make. I thought about Dr. Patel, who had seemed like a thoughtful woman and who had, if Kwame's account was accurate, said something she should not have said to someone she had no authorization to say it to. I thought about the 18 months since Bernard died, during which I had made myself small in 100 ways I hadn't fully acknowledged, letting Kwame manage, letting a day's worry, letting my children's grief for their father transform me into something they needed to tend. It was understandable. It was also done. The kettle whistled. I made myself a cup of tea, rooibos, no milk, Bernard's preference that had become my own over 30 years of marriage, and carried it back to Bernard's desk, to my legal pad and my compliance binders. I picked up my phone. I found the number for Dr. Patel's office, the general line that routed to an answering service after hours. I could call in the morning. But I wanted to be accurate about when I'd made the decision, so I wrote it down, 9:22 p.m., October 14th, intent to contact practice regarding compliance concern. Then I set the phone down and thought about the question of how to begin. In 22 years of healthcare compliance, I had been on the other side of this call many times. I had been the person answering. I had been the person conducting the investigation, filing the report, sitting across the table from providers who had made decisions they hadn't thought through carefully enough. I knew how this process worked from the inside out. I also knew that most patients who called to raise a concern were nervous, apologetic, unsure of themselves. They called to ask if maybe something might possibly have been a little bit of a problem. They gave the practice room to reassure them. They let themselves be soothed. I picked up the phone and dialed. The answering service told me the office opened at 8. In the morning, then. I would call in the morning, and I would ask to speak with whoever managed their HIPAA compliance. And when the receptionist, who would probably be Courtney, with her purple marker and her cheerfully mislabeled fish, asked if there was a problem, I would give her the honest answer. I'm not sure yet, but I'd like to find out. I set the phone down beside the legal pad, both of them lit by the small lamp on Bernard's desk. The tea was cooling. The oak tree outside was invisible in the dark. I had spent 22 years being the person who knew what the rules were and made sure other people followed them. I had spent 18 months being someone's mother, someone's widow, someone who needed managing. I picked up the legal pad. I uncapped the pen. I was not done writing. The first entry in my pattern log was from Christmas dinner 2 years ago. I hadn't thought of it as evidence at the time. I'd thought of it as Kwame being Kwame, the concerned son, the doctor who couldn't fully leave work at the door, the young man who had watched his father get sick and had decided, somewhere in that grief, that information was armor. I understood the impulse. I had spent 22 years working alongside physicians who believed that knowing everything about everyone they loved was a form of protection. It isn't. But I understood it. We'd been sitting at my dining room table. Bernard was still with us then, thinner than he should have been, but present, laughing at something Adaizi's oldest had said. Kwame had passed me the plantains and said, almost parenthetically, "Mom, Dr. Okonkwo mentioned your blood pressure was running a little high at your last visit. You should watch the salt." Bernard had glanced at me. I'd glanced at Bernard. Then Kwame had moved on to something else. And the moment had dissolved into the noise of Christmas dinner, and I had filed it in the drawer labeled Kwame Worries. That's how he loves, and left it there. I pulled it out now and looked at it differently. Dr. Okonkwo. I had seen him twice 3 years ago for a routine physical and a follow-up. He was affiliated with Riverside Regional, where Kwame had admitting privileges. Same hospital system. Shared electronic health record. I had never mentioned my blood pressure to Kwame. I had never mentioned Dr. Okonkwo at all. I wrote it down. Date, location, exact words as I remembered them. The name of the physician whose practice fed into the system Kwame could navigate. Then I kept going. The physical therapy referral had been in the spring, 18 months ago, 2 weeks after Bernard died. I'd strained my lower back moving furniture. Grief has a way of expressing itself in physical projects, in the rearrangement of spaces that no longer feel like they fit. I'd seen a physiatrist, gotten the referral, done 6 weeks of PT without mentioning any of it to my children, because they were already worried enough, and I was perfectly capable of managing a muscle strain. Kwame had texted me in June. "How's the PT going? Hope the back is feeling better." I had replied, "Much better, thank you." And I had thought, vaguely, that perhaps a Daisy had mentioned it, though I hadn't told a Daisy either. And then I had moved on. I wrote it down. The cortisone shots were the entry that made me set the pen down for a moment. I'd had them done in September at a sports medicine practice on the north side, not affiliated with Riverside Regional, but accepting my insurance, which ran through a clearinghouse I hadn't thought to investigate. Left knee, mild osteoarthritis, nothing dramatic, but the ache had been waking me up, and I didn't want to become a person who complained about her knees. I had told no one. I had driven myself there and driven myself home and made myself soup and watched a British mystery series and felt perfectly fine about all of it. Kwame had called in October, before the Dr. Patel appointment, before any of this had crystallized, and said, "Mom, are you still doing the cortisone shots? Because if the knee's not responding, there are some orthopedic surgeons at the group I could connect you with." I had said I was fine. I had changed the subject. Now I sat at Bernard's desk and looked at that entry and felt something settle in my chest that was not anger exactly. It was closer to the feeling I used to get when an audit came back and confirmed what I had suspected all along. A kind of grim, airless clarity. The cortisone shots. A sports medicine practice I had chosen for its distance from anything Kwame was connected to. Information that had no ordinary path from that office to my son's phone. I wrote the date, the words, the name of the practice, the approximate timeline. I noted that this predated the Dr. Patel incident by 3 weeks, that whatever mechanism Kwame was using, it had been operating before I'd chosen a new primary care physician and carefully withheld his name from the authorization form. The pattern was not a coincidence. Coincidences don't have billing codes. I called Patrice on a Wednesday morning, standing in my kitchen with my second cup of coffee and my legal pad, and she picked up on the third ring the way she always had, even in the years when we were both fielding 3 crises before noon. "Miriam Osei-Bonsu," she said. "I was wondering when you'd call." "You didn't know I was going to call." "I knew eventually. You've been quiet for 2 years, which means you've either been healing or you've been building something." A pause. "Bernard?" 18 months ago. Yes. I'm sorry. I should have called. You sent flowers. Very good ones." I set my coffee down. "Patrice, I need to talk through something with you, professionally." She had the particular quality of silence that good attorneys develop, the kind that means I'm listening and I'm not going to fill the space for you. "It involves HIPAA," I said. "And my son." Another pause, different in texture. "Lunch on Friday?" Patrice looked exactly as I expected. Sharp, unhurried, wearing the kind of quietly expensive blazer that said I have won cases in this. She'd been a health information privacy attorney for 15 years, the last 8 at her own small firm, and she had the posture of someone who had spent a decade and a half being the smartest person at tables where nobody wanted to admit it. She was also the person who had talked me off the ledge in 2014 when a cardiac surgeon at the hospital had accessed his ex-wife's post-surgical records from a different facility using credentials she hadn't revoked. And I had been 30 seconds from calling the Office for Civil Rights before Patrice walked me through the internal process first. She understood both the law and the landscape, which was rarer than it should have been. We ordered at the counter. It was the kind of restaurant where you order at the counter, modern and slightly loud, which I'd chosen deliberately because privacy matters even in private conversations. I spread my legal pad on the table between us, the pages fanned slightly so she could see the structure without reading every word. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, without expression, without rushing. "Walk me through it," she said. I walked her through it. The Dr. Patel call, with the specific LDL mention, the pattern of earlier incidents, the Christmas blood pressure, the physical therapy referral, the cortisone shots. Paulette's remark about Kwame knowing which practice I'd chosen before I'd told him. The fact that I had signed no authorization form listing Kwame as a recipient at any of the practices involved. Patrice ate her salad while I talked. When I finished, she set her fork down. "Okay," she said, "let's separate the threads." This was what I'd always loved about working with her. No preamble, no reassurance, straight to the structure. Thread 1, Dr. Patel's office. If a staff member verbally confirmed your lab values to someone who called and identified himself as family or as a physician colleague, without verifying a signed authorization or a formal treatment relationship, that's a disclosure violation under 164.502. Plain and simple. The mechanism doesn't need to be sophisticated. A phone call and a loose front desk staffer is enough. "I know," I said. "I've seen it happen." "So have I. Thread 2 is more interesting." She turned her water glass slowly. "Your son is a physician employed by a multi-specialty group. That group is a covered entity. If Kwame accessed your records through any shared system, Riverside Regional's electronic health record, an insurance clearinghouse that routes your explanation of benefits, a health information exchange that his practice participates in, without a formal treatment relationship with you, that is unauthorized access." "Minimum necessary standard," I said. "Minimum necessary, yes. And more than that, the privacy rule requires that employees of covered entities access protected health information only to the extent necessary to perform their job functions. Checking your mother's lab values is not a job function. It doesn't matter that he's a doctor. It doesn't matter that he's your doctor in the informal. My son knows about medicine sense. The question is whether he had a legitimate need under his employment to access those specific records." She met my eyes. "Did he? No. Then, if he accessed them, he violated his employer's HIPAA policies, and potentially the privacy rule itself. His practice group's compliance department would have obligations once they became aware of it. I noted this on my legal pad, not because I didn't know it, but because I wanted it written in the context of a legal consultation. Old habit. Document the advice alongside the facts. "The intent question," I said. Patrice made a small sound, not quite dismissive, but close. "Intent is not a defense under the privacy rule. It's relevant to the question of willfulness, which affects the penalty tier. But it does not determine whether a violation occurred. The question is simple. Did authorization exist? If the answer is no, the analysis starts there. He thinks he was being helpful. I'm sure he does." She picked up her fork again. "Miriam, in 15 years of health information law, I have defended exactly 2 deliberate bad actors. Everyone else thought they were being helpful. The resident who pulled his grandmother's chart to see if her cardiologist had noted the same symptom he'd noticed at Thanksgiving. The nurse who looked up a neighbor's HIV status because the neighbor had recently started dating her brother and she was worried. The administrator who accessed a colleague's mental health records because she was concerned about performance issues and wanted context. She shook her head. Helpful is not the standard. Authorization is the standard. I thought about Kwame, his face at Christmas dinner, earnest and careful, passing the plantains and slipping in that observation about my blood pressure, the way he slipped in everything, wrapped in warmth, framed as care. I thought about the call from Dr. Patel's office, the LDL number dropped into conversation like a footnote. He did not know he had built a case file on himself. "What do I do next?" I asked, even though I already had a list. Patrice smiled, the first time since we'd sat down. "You know what to do next. I want to hear you say it. Get your medical records from every practice involved, all of them, not just Dr. Patel, Dr. Okonkwo's practice, the physiatrist, the sports medicine office, and invoke your right under 45 CFR Section 164.528, the accounting of disclosures, the provision that most patients have never heard of and most practices hope they never invoke. Under the privacy rule, patients have the right to receive a written accounting of disclosures their covered entity has made of their protected health information for purposes other than treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. It doesn't capture everything, but it captures the disclosures that fall outside normal care channels, exactly the kind that had apparently been made to my son. "I'll send formal written requests," I said, "with the citation. Include the citation. It tells them you know what you're asking for." She tilted her head. "Request the audit log from Dr. Patel's office specifically. If this disclosure was made by phone, there may be a call log, a front desk note, something. Practices are supposed to document their disclosures. They often don't." "No," she agreed, "but sometimes they do, and sometimes the absence of documentation is its own kind of evidence." I wrote audit log, Dr. Patel, and circled it. "Patrice," I said, "if I file with the Office for Civil Rights—" "When?" she said mildly. "When I file. What does Kwame's practice group face separately? If you also file a complaint with the group's internal compliance department, which you should do as a parallel track, they are obligated to investigate. If they find that one of their physicians accessed non-patient records without authorization, they face potential sanctions up to and including termination, depending on their internal policies. They also face potential Office for Civil Rights scrutiny if the access was through a system connected to their infrastructure." She paused. "It would not be a comfortable position for a young physician in the early part of his career." I looked at my legal pad. I thought about that deliberately. "I'm not trying to end his career," I said. "I know you're not." Her voice was even. "But you need to decide what outcome you want, because that will shape how you proceed and at what point. Office for Civil Rights complaints can be resolved through informal resolution or voluntary compliance. The office has discretion. A complaint to his employer's compliance department may or may not result in formal discipline, depending on their policies and what the investigation finds." She folded her hands on the table. "But here is what I want to be clear about. You have every right to pursue this. Every single right. What happened to your medical information was not acceptable regardless of who did it or why." I nodded. I already knew this, but there was something about hearing it said plainly by someone who had spent 15 years in this work that settled the last uncertain corner of my resolve. "Give me a week," I said. The formal records requests went out by certified mail on a Monday morning, one to Dr. Patel's office, one to Dr. Okonkwo's practice, one to the physiatrist, one to the sports medicine office. Each letter was a page and a half, written on paper rather than sent by email, because paper creates its own documentary trail. Each one invoked my rights under 45 CFR Section 164.524 for the complete record and Section 164.528 for the accounting of disclosures. Each one specified that I was requesting documentation of any disclosures made outside of treatment, payment, and healthcare operations, including verbal disclosures, during the relevant time period. Each one noted the regulatory timeline for response, 30 days, with a possible extension of another 30. I kept copies of every letter. I kept the certified mail receipts. I noted the dates in my log. Then I waited. Dr. Patel's office called 4 days later. The woman on the phone, not Courtney, someone with more administrative authority and considerably more wariness in her voice, said she was the office manager, that she'd received my letter, and that she wanted to understand what I was looking for. I told her clearly and without embellishment. I was requesting my complete medical record and a written accounting of all disclosures of my protected health information outside of treatment, payment, and healthcare operations purposes. I gave her the regulatory citation again. I told her I appreciated their prompt response and looked forward to receiving the materials within the statutory timeline. A silence. "Is there something specific that prompted this request?" she asked. "Yes," I said pleasantly. "That's what the accounting will help clarify." The records arrived 11 days later, on a Thursday, in a large manila envelope with the practice's return address in the corner. I sat at Bernard's desk and went through them the way I'd gone through audit reports for 2 decades, methodically, from the beginning, not skipping to the end even though I knew what I was looking for. My intake forms, my vital signs, Dr. Patel's clinical notes from the initial visit, thorough and well organized, reflecting exactly the conversation I remembered. My lab results, printed on the lab company's letterhead with the date and the panel clearly marked, and then, 3 pages from the back, a brief administrative notation in the format the office used for non-routine contacts. It was dated 2 days after my lab results had been finalized. Physician inquiry patient. Caller identified as family member and physician. Requested lab result status. Front desk confirmed lipid panel results verbally per caller request. No authorization form on file. Note added for compliance review. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, more slowly, the way you read something when you want to be certain you're reading what you think you're reading. No authorization form on file. Someone at Dr. Patel's front desk had confirmed my lab results, verbally, to a caller who had identified himself as both a family member and a physician, without any signed authorization on file. They had noted it. They had flagged it for compliance review. And then, apparently, nothing further had happened. I photographed every page with my phone, front to back, in good light. I sent the photographs to Patrice with a message that said simply, "Page 14, note at the bottom." Her reply came within the hour. "There it is." The family dinner was Kwame's idea, which should have told me something. He'd suggested it 2 weeks earlier. A Sunday at my house, just close family, nothing elaborate. My sister Gloria and her husband Kwame and Abina Adesi on video call from Atlanta with the kids. He'd offered to bring jollof rice, which he made from Bernard's recipe with the particular pride of a man who has learned one dish extremely well and considers it sufficient. I made egusi soup and plantains. I set the table with the good dishes because Gloria would notice if I didn't. The house smelled the way it used to smell on Sundays when the children were small, and I allowed myself to feel that for a moment before I heard Kwame's car in the driveway. We were 40 minutes into dinner. Adaizi's face on the laptop propped at her usual end of the table, her daughter showing everyone a gap where a molar had been. When Kwame set down his spoon with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been waiting to say something, "I've been meaning to bring something up," he said. He was looking at me, but his voice was pitched for the table. "I've been keeping an eye on Mom's health over the last year or so, and I really think it would make sense for her to consolidate her care through the wellness clinic we just opened at the group. Preventive focus, integrated records, the whole picture in one place." "They're excellent." Gloria nodded. She made a sound of approval. My older sister, 63 years old, deferring automatically to authority in a white coat, nodding at her nephew, the doctor. "That's a great idea," she said. "Miriam, you should listen to him." Abena, to her credit, said nothing. She reached for her water glass. Adaize, on the laptop, was frowning slightly at something one of her children was doing off-screen. My grandchildren ate their rice, and I watched Kwame, his face open and earnest, his hands resting easy on the table, the portrait of a caring son who happened to have relevant expertise. And I understood something with a clarity that was almost tender in its sharpness. He did not know who I was. Not really. He knew Mom, the woman who had worked in hospital administration, who knew more than the average person about medical things, who had kept the family's paperwork in order and managed Bernard's care in those final months with the quiet efficiency everyone had commented on. He knew the mother who made a goosey soup and walked every morning and smiled when he brought groceries. He knew someone who, by his assessment, needed her medical information centralized in a system he could access, managed by colleagues he could call, organized in a way that would allow him to continue doing what he had apparently been doing for at least 2 years. He thought he was taking care of her. He thought she didn't know. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. My voice was warm. I meant it to be warm. "That's so thoughtful. Let's talk about it." Gloria looked relieved. Kwame smiled. The conversation moved on. I refilled everyone's water and said very little for the rest of the evening, and no one noticed, because that is the thing about being underestimated. People stop watching you. The Office for Civil Rights Health Information Privacy Complaint Form is not a simple document, but it is not complicated if you know what you're doing. I had reviewed hundreds of them over the course of my career. I had helped draft internal policies specifically designed to prevent them. I worked on it at Bernard's desk over the course of a week, in the evenings after I finished my consulting work, with my legal pad and the records from Dr. Patel's office arranged neatly beside the laptop. The complaint against Dr. Patel's practice was straightforward. A covered entity had disclosed a patient's protected health information, specifically lab results, to a third party who had not been authorized by the patient, in the absence of any signed authorization form, without confirming a legitimate treatment relationship between the caller and the patient's care team. I documented the regulatory basis. 45 CFR Section 164.502, the general prohibition on unauthorized disclosure. I attached the relevant page from the records, the administrative note that had named itself as evidence. The second complaint was addressed not to the Office for Civil Rights, but to the Compliance Department of Kwame's medical group. I had found their compliance hotline and their designated compliance officer on the group's public website, required disclosures for covered entities, available to anyone who looks. This complaint was more carefully constructed, because I wanted it to be precise about what I was alleging and what I was not. I was not alleging that Kwame had committed a crime. I was not alleging malicious intent. I was documenting specific instances in which a physician employed by the group appeared to have accessed or received my protected health information without a treatment relationship or patient authorization, potentially through systems connected to the group's infrastructure or peer networks, over a period of approximately 2 years. I attached my pattern log. I attached the accounting of disclosures. I attached the administrative note from Dr. Patel's office. Patrice reviewed both drafts. She made 3 small suggestions, all of them good. I incorporated them. She told me both complaints were solid and that I was free to file whenever I was ready. I set them aside and waited. This, too, was something 22 years had taught me. The filing date matters less than the preparation. A premature complaint with incomplete documentation is a gift to the respondent. It gives them time to cure the violation and claim good faith. It gives their attorneys room to argue that the incident was isolated, addressed, remediated. It hands them the narrative. A complete complaint with a documented pattern and a paper trail that includes their own administrative notes is a different instrument entirely. I want him to feel completely safe before this lands, I had told Patrice, and she had looked at me over her reading glasses with the expression of a woman who had known me for 12 years and was glad in that moment that she was on my side. I made myself tea in the evenings and sat at Bernard's desk and reread my notes and thought about timing. I was not angry. I was something more precise than angry. I was ready in the way that a person is ready when they have done all the preparation that can be done, and the only remaining question is when. The answer came on a Tuesday. I was folding the documents into a manila envelope, the Office for Civil Rights Complaint, the supporting records, the accounting of disclosures, the pattern log. When my phone buzzed on the desk, Kwame, I answered on the second ring, because I always answered on the second ring. Mom. He sounded cheerful, the particular brightness of someone who has done something they're pleased about. I have good news. I talked to Dr. Harrington at our wellness clinic. She's wonderful. You'll love her. And I've arranged for you to be added as a priority intake patient. First available slot is next month. I've already pulled your background information to start the intake file. I looked at the envelope in my hands. I've already pulled your background information. He said it the way you say something that is obviously helpful, obviously appropriate, obviously the natural thing for a concerned son to do. He said it with the confidence of someone who did not know the documentation that existed. That was building. That was sitting in a manila envelope I was holding while he spoke. That's so thoughtful of you, Kwame, I said. The warmth in my voice was real. I want that to be understood. I love my son. I loved him in this moment, even as I was looking at that envelope. Love and consequence are not mutually exclusive. I had spent 22 years in healthcare understanding that the most painful corrective actions are often taken against people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. We should sit down and talk about all of this very soon, I said. Absolutely, he said. How's Sunday? Sunday is perfect. We said goodbye. I set the phone down. I picked up a pen and wrote his name on the front of the envelope in my neat compliance office handwriting. The handwriting that had labeled hundreds of files, hundreds of incident reports, hundreds of cases that had begun with someone believing that caring about a person meant having the right to know everything about them. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter where the morning light would find it. Sunday, I thought. Sunday is perfect. I arrived 12 minutes early. This was deliberate. In my experience, the person who arrives first controls the room. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the small ways that matter. You choose your seat. You settle yourself. You have a moment to look at everything before the other person walks in and starts performing. Kwame's office was on the third floor of his medical group's main building, a glass and steel structure off the interstate that had gone up 4 years ago with the kind of architectural confidence that said we are a serious institution. His name was on the door in silver lettering, Dr. K. Osei-Bonsu, M.D. Family Medicine. Below it, a small laminated card with his patient satisfaction rating, 4.8 out of 5. His assistant, a young man named Terrell, who had met me twice before at the group's holiday events, offered me water and said the doctor would be right in. I thanked him and took the chair across from Kwame's desk, the patient chair lower than the physician's chair by approximately 2 inches, upholstered in the same dusty blue as every other chair in every medical waiting room I had ever sat in. I set my bag on the floor. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at his desk. It was organized the way organized people organize things when they want to appear busier than they are. A laptop angled, a coffee mug from his medical school, a framed photograph of our whole family at Adeza's wedding 6 years ago, Bernard's arm around my shoulders, everyone laughing at something caught just off camera. I looked at that photograph for a long moment. He loved you, I thought, not for the first time. That's the thing you have to hold on to. He loved you, and he thought love meant access. I heard him in the hall before I saw him. His voice, warm and expansive, saying something to Terrell about a patient file. Then the door opened, and he was in the room, already smiling, already in doctor mode, the version of himself he'd been wearing since his residency, confident, capable, the man with the answers. "Mom," he leaned down to kiss my cheek. "I'm glad you came around on this. Dr. Harrington is really—" "Sit down, Kwame." Something in my voice made him stop. Not alarm, not yet, just a small recalibration. The way you pause when a sound doesn't quite match the environment. He went around his desk and sat. He looked at me with the particular expression of a son who has just noticed his mother is not quite the version of herself he expected to find. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I need to show you some things." I reached into my bag. "And I need you to look at them carefully." I placed 3 documents on his desk. The first was the page from Dr. Patel's records. The administrative notation, the one with no auth form on file at the bottom, the one I had photographed and sent to Patrice and read perhaps 20 times since it arrived. I set it squarely in front of him and watched his eyes find the text. The second was a printed copy of 45 CFR Section 164.502. The relevant sections highlighted in yellow. I had used a real highlighter, not digital markup, because I wanted him to see the physical deliberateness of it. I had highlighted the general prohibition on unauthorized disclosure. I had highlighted the definition of a covered entity. I had highlighted the section on authorized recipients and what authorization requires. The third was the Office for Civil Rights Complaint Confirmation, the email from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, stamped with a case number, acknowledging receipt of my complaint against Dr. Patel's practice and indicating that the complaint had been assigned for review. I watched his face. This is something you learn in compliance work, to watch faces without projecting onto them, to let the expression complete itself without rushing it toward the interpretation you expect. I watched Kwame's face move through the documents in sequence. The administrative notation brought a frown of confusion. The regulatory text brought a deepening stillness. The complaint confirmation brought a particular kind of recognition that traveled from his eyes to his jaw and settled in the set of his shoulders. Professional fear. I had seen it before. It looks different from personal fear. more contained, more calculating, because the professional part of the brain begins running contingencies even while the personal part is still absorbing the news. He looked up at me. "Mom, let me say this first," I said. "Then you can talk." He closed his mouth, one of the things I had always respected about my son. He knew how to listen when the moment required it. I spent 22 years enforcing these rules, I said. I wrote training modules on this exact scenario, a physician accessing the records of a family member who is not their patient through a shared system or a peer network without authorization. I sat across from doctors who were brilliant and well-meaning and absolutely certain that their intentions made the access acceptable. I had to explain to every one of them that intention is not the standard. Authorization is the standard. He was very still. "You have been accessing my health information," I said. "Not as my physician. I am not your patient, and you are not part of my care team. Through whatever combination of shared systems and phone calls and collegial courtesy you used, you have been receiving my protected health information without my authorization. You commented on my blood pressure at Christmas dinner 2 years ago, information from Dr. Okonkwo's practice, which shares Riverside Regional's electronic health record system. You knew about my physical therapy referral that I told no one about. You asked about cortisone shots I received in silence at a practice I chose specifically because it had no connection to your network." I paused. "And you called Dr. Patel's office, and someone there confirmed my lab values to you on the phone, without a signed authorization form. They noted it. That notation is the first document in front of you." He looked down at the page again, then back at me. "I thought—" He started. "I know what you thought," I said. "I need you to understand what the law says." The silence in the room had a quality I recognized, the silence of a space where something has just shifted in a direction that cannot be reversed. "What happens next?" he said. His voice was careful, the doctor's voice, not the son's. "The Office for Civil Rights Complaint is against Dr. Patel's practice, not against you personally, at this stage. They will investigate the covered entity. That investigation will look at their disclosure protocols, their staff training, their documentation practices." I kept my voice even. "I have also submitted a complaint to your medical group's compliance department, documenting the pattern. Documenting my concern that a physician employed here may have accessed non-patient records through systems connected to this practice's infrastructure." He went very still in a different way, the stillness of someone whose professional life has just come into view as a landscape that looks entirely different than it did this morning. "You filed with the group," he said. "Yes. Miriam." He stopped, tried again. "Mom, I know," I said. And I did know. I could see it, the full weight of what I was telling him settling across his shoulders, the understanding of what he had done translating into the understanding of what it could cost him. I felt the complicated thing that mothers feel when they watch their children face consequences, sorrow and necessity, braided together so tightly you cannot find the seam. "I know this is not what you intended." I have never doubted that. "But Kwame, you made me your patient without my consent. You made yourself my physician without a treatment relationship. You decided that being my son and being a doctor meant the rules that govern every patient you see every day didn't apply to your own mother." He looked at the family photograph on his desk. I let him look. "You need to call your legal counsel today," I said. "Report this yourself before the complaint reaches them through another channel. That matters. Self-reporting matters in any investigation, and your compliance office will note when they received your disclosure relative to when they received mine. Do not wait." He nodded. Slowly. "Okay." And you need to hear me say this clearly. I do not want to see your career ended. That has never been my goal. I leaned forward slightly. My goal is for you to understand what you did. Really understand it. Not as a technicality, not as a paperwork error, but as a fundamental violation of something I have the right to. My own medical information, my own decisions about who knows what about my body. I held his gaze. You did not ask. You decided. And the difference between those two things is the entire point. He was quiet for a long moment. I thought I was looking out for you, he said. I know. My voice softened just slightly. That's what I'm going to ask you to think about between now and Sunday. He called his group's legal counsel before he left at the building that afternoon. Patrice told me 3 days later, through channels that were appropriate and legal, because Patrice understood what appropriate and legal looked like, that the compliance department had opened an internal investigation and had temporarily suspended Kwame's access to the shared health information exchange pending its findings. He would be required to complete remedial privacy training under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Mandatory, documented, the kind that goes into your personnel file and follows you to every credentialing application you fill out for the rest of your career. I thought about the training modules I used to write, the slide decks with the red headers, the case studies, the section I always called but I was just trying to help. Why, intent doesn't determine outcome. I thought about all the physicians who had sat in those rooms, arms crossed, certain the rules didn't apply to them. I hoped the modules he was assigned were good ones. Dr. Patel's practice received their Office for Civil Rights Inquiry within 2 weeks of my complaint filing. I know this because Dr. Patel called me herself, not through Courtney, not through the office manager, but directly from what I assumed was her personal cell because it was 7 in the evening. Ms. Osei-Bonsu, she said, I owe you an apology and an explanation. I gave her the silence that good attorneys and good compliance officers learn to offer. The inquiry prompted an internal audit, she said. We discovered that the front desk has been operating under an informal understanding, not a policy, which is itself a problem. That verbal confirmation of basic information to callers who identify as family is acceptable. It is not. I should have caught it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. Thank you for telling me, I said. We're revising our disclosure protocols. All staff are being retrained. We're sending notification letters to patients who may have been affected by this practice during the relevant period. A pause. The investigator asked whether you would be willing to characterize the violation as non-willful and cooperate with the corrective action plan rather than pursuing the matter to civil penalty. I considered this. The civil monetary penalty structure under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act runs from $100 per violation for unknowing violations all the way to $50,000 per violation for willful neglect. A systemic front desk practice of confirming information without authorization was not nothing. It was a training failure, a policy failure, the kind of thing that happens when practices grow faster than their compliance infrastructure. But it was not predatory. Dr. Patel had called me herself in the evening to apologize. I'll cooperate with the corrective action plan, I said, provided the protocol revisions are substantive and the staff retraining is documented. They will be, she said. Ms. Osei-Bonsu, may I ask what you do professionally? Healthcare privacy consulting, I said. Previously, hospital compliance. A beat of silence that contained, I thought, a full reappraisal. I see, she said. Well, I imagine you knew exactly what you were looking for. I knew exactly what I was looking for, I agreed. Kwame called on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after our meeting in his office. He had clearly been sitting with things. There was a quality to his voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager processing something he didn't yet have language for. "I've been reading," he said, "about the privacy rule, about the minimum necessary standard." A pause. "I read some of the enforcement cases." "Good," I said. "There was one, a hospital employee who accessed his ex-girlfriend's records. They terminated him. He fought it and lost." Another pause. "There was another one, a nurse checking on a family member without authorization. She lost her license for 2 years." "I know those cases," I said. "I've used them in training." "Mom." His voice shifted, the doctor voice dissolving into something younger, less fortified. "I had no idea. I genuinely thought that because I was your son, and because I'm a physician, I was helping. I thought the rules were for people with bad intentions." "I know you did," I said. "That's the most common misunderstanding I spent my career correcting." I set my coffee down. "The rules exist because the alternative is a world where anyone with access and good intentions can decide what you know about yourself, what gets shared, who gets to weigh in on your body and your choices. The rules exist because I meant well has never in the history of medicine been a sufficient protection for the patient." He was quiet. "You made me your patient, Kwame, without asking. For 2 years, maybe longer, you positioned yourself as the person managing my health picture. And I am 58 years old, I am healthy, I am trained in exactly this area, and I never gave you that role." I let that sit for a moment. "If you want to be part of my health care, there is a process. There is a form. It requires my signature. That's all it ever required." "The investigator asked if you'd submit a statement," he said, "about whether you want the complaint to go to formal penalty proceedings." "I know. Will you?" I thought about Bernard's photograph on Kwame's desk. I thought about Christmas dinner, the plantains, the blood pressure comment that I had filed in the wrong drawer for 2 years. I thought about who my son was underneath the white coat and the certainty. The boy who had cried for 3 hours when his father's first diagnosis came through, who had thrown himself into medicine partly because he had watched medicine fail the person he loved most, who had decided somewhere in that crucible that information was the only armor that worked. "I'll submit a statement recommending resolution through corrective action rather than civil penalty," I said. "That's what I want. The group to fix its systems, you to understand what you did, the practices involved to do better. That's the outcome." I paused. "But I need you to hear something first, and really hear it." "Okay." "What you did was not a technicality. It was not a paperwork problem. You decided without asking me that you had the right to know things about my body that I hadn't chosen to tell you. And somewhere inside that decision was the assumption that I needed to be managed, that grief and widowhood and being your mother made me someone who couldn't be trusted to handle her own information, her own care, her own choices." My voice was steady. "I need you to know that assumption was wrong. I need you to know I noticed it. And I need you to know that if you want to be in my life the way I want you in my life, as my son, not as my physician, we start from scratch. You ask, I decide, that's the agreement." A long pause. "Yeah," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Okay, good." I picked up my coffee. "Come to dinner Sunday. Bring a bena. I'll make jollof." I mailed the form on a Monday, in a standard business envelope with no return address. He would know the handwriting. It was a blank authorization form, clean and standard, the kind I had reviewed hundreds of times. It had fields for the patient's name, the authorized recipient, the scope of access, the duration, the patient's signature, and the date. everything properly labeled, everything exactly as the regulation requires. I had written a note on a separate card, not on the form, because you don't write on forms that aren't yet completed. The note said, if you want to be part of my health care, ask. That's all you ever had to do. Mom, the form was unsigned. The signature line waited. I had not yet decided what I would fill in. 3 weeks later, I sat in Dr. Patel's waiting room for my follow-up. The fish tank had been cleaned. The algae was gone. The glass clear, the 2 goldfish, still named Nemo and Dory, still both orange, still not informed of the error, moving through the water with something that looked almost like ease. Someone had added a small castle decoration to the gravel. Progress. The walls were still beige. The cholesterol pamphlets were still there, the colon screening brochure still sun-faded, the chairs still dusty blue. But at the front desk, a new intake coordinator, young with careful eyes and a checklist visible on her screen, was working through paperwork with a patient ahead of me with a thoroughness that hadn't been there before. I could hear her explaining the authorization form. I could hear her being clear about what signing it meant and what not signing it meant. When it was my turn, she smiled and confirmed my name, my insurance, my appointment. Is there anyone you'd like listed as an emergency contact with access to your health records? She asked. Her eyes were on her screen. The question routine, the protocol now being followed as protocol should be. I thought about Kwame. I thought about him sitting across from me in his office, the family photograph at his elbow, watching his professional certainty come apart in the particular, irreversible way that things come apart when someone who knows exactly what they're doing shows you, document by document, what you've done. I thought about his voice on that Saturday morning, younger than I'd heard it in years, reading enforcement cases the way he used to read ahead in his textbooks before exams, trying to understand the full weight of something. I thought about the form sitting on his kitchen counter now, my handwriting on the envelope, the signature line waiting. I thought about Bernard, who had always known exactly who I was, who had teased me about sanitation protocols in restaurants, and then, when the serious moments came, had handed me his power of attorney and his end-of-life documents and said, "You know what to do." Not because he was relinquishing control, but because he trusted me with his, who had understood in the way that people understand when they have been known completely that love does not require access. It requires trust. The two are not the same. Not yet, I said. The coordinator nodded and made her note. But I know how to add someone when I'm ready. She handed me my paperwork. I took it to the dusty blue chair in the corner, my chair, I'd come to think of it, and sat down. I found a pen in my bag, the one I'd brought from home because the waiting room pens always ran out of ink at the wrong moment. I turned to page 7. I read every line.